Thank you very much, Theo, and thank you very much indeed to Professor Andrea Acri for agreeing to talk for us. Professor Acri, his first degree was from the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and he took an MA and PhD from Leiden University, University of Leiden. And all his work, of course, had a focus on South and Southeast Asian studies, and particularly a philological approach using Sanskrit and, relatively unusually in our field, Old Javanese, which has enabled him to produce all kinds of fascinating studies in the discipline, and of course religious studies as well. Since then, he's held research and teaching positions in India at Nalanda University, Singapore, Australia, and the Netherlands. But since 2016, he's been in Paris, where he's maître de conférence, which is a tenured professorship in Tantric Studies. Can't be many of them around, I suppose. Professor of Tantric Studies. Now, I find these all very confusing, and I won't try to understand it exactly, the divisions of Parisian academia, but in the religious studies section of the École Pratique des Hautes Études Paris. And he's also a member of the EPHE, the École Française d'Extrême Orient, in particular as part of this amazing, huge Dharma project, which is funded by an ERC Synergy grant. His research is quite wide-ranging, in particular sort of fascinating looks at the maritime connections of South and Southeast Asia, that looks at the history and circulation of Śaiva and Buddhist Tantric traditions in those regions, yoga studies, Indian philosophy, and of course the religious history specifically of Java and Bali. He's published extremely widely. I just sort of mention a few highlights. The Dharma Patanjala, which I think was a reworking of a PhD thesis, which is a Śaiva scripture from ancient Java. There's also recent books on this kind of maritime world of interaction between South and Southeast Asia, including cultural transfers in early monsoon age. I think that's an edited volume, and esoteric Buddhism in medieval maritime Asia. All absolutely fascinating stuff, just showing how important it is for understanding the religious traditions of any of these areas to look at the wider picture. And today, Professor Acri is going to talk to us about yoga in Javanese and Balinese, Shaiva and Hindu traditions. So once again, thank you very much, Andrea, and over to you.
Thank you, Jim, for this most kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you are able to see it. Very good. Indeed, thank you for inviting me. So today I will be talking about yoga in Javanese and Balinese, Shaiva and Hindu traditions. It's still a rather esoteric topic in the sense that not much research has been produced to this day, but I hope it is becoming increasingly, more and more people is getting involved. Eventually they will get involved. So I will take you, beyond the borders of the Indian subcontinent, kind of imaginary borders, if you ask me, across the Indian Ocean, to this island, these two islands, Java and Bali, so located at the, let's say, southeastern corner of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, this trans-local, transnational, trans-regional cultural formation of the ancient world, where Sanskrit language was used and where Indian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shaivism, etc., developed kind of in parallel with those in their homeland, South Asia. So these are the islands, very big island of Java, and just next to it, Bali, much smaller. And so, as I said, these two islands were part of, we can say, a continuum, a cultural continuum, even though they had their own languages, very different, from Sanskrit. Still, they absorbed, they incorporated many, many elements of Indic cultures. And as you may know, nowadays they belong to the nation state of Indonesia. And Java is mostly Islam, has adopted Islam since the 15th, 16th century, whereas Bali is still Hindu to these days. So basically, in a historical period from perhaps the 5th or 6th century AD, maybe even much before, there was a transfer of Indic elements to these islands, and yoga was no exception. So we also have yoga traditions in Java and Bali. Now I will just go through quickly some art historical evidence, and then I will move to discuss the textual sources. So one interesting, art historical evidence of the existence of yoga is actually found on a Buddhist monument, the Borobudur, perhaps the single largest Buddhist monument in the world. Now, the late art historian Jan Fontaine described a panel. You can find actually hundreds of carved, reliefs on the monument, and one of them was described as Maitreya, standing on one leg in a typical yoga fashion. Okay, so according to him, actually this passage describes the so-called Ekapada Bakasana, so the yoga posture where the yogin stands on one leg. Okay, just resembles the baka is the heron in Sanskrit, so just like the bird, basically, it's an imitation of the posture of a bird named after that. And so actually this passage occurs in a scripture, the Gandavyuha, translated by Prajna, a monk who traveled from India, from Orissa actually, to China, bringing scriptures within, and probably influenced even the reliefs of the Borobudur, because this text is very important on the monument, and there are not so many other representations of this text in the Indic world. So this could be a kind of early, type of asana, and it's interesting that it is indeed mentioned in a Buddhist context rather than a Shaiva or Hindu context. But in India, of course, we already find it since in the Mahabharata and other early scriptures. Then we move to a Shaiva monument, Chandi Shiva in Prambanan in central Java, slightly later, the mid of the 9th century. And we see that basically Shiva is represented many times. So there are various forms of Shiva manifestations. And as you can see, Shiva here is prominently represented as a yogin in a kind of yogic posture, probably Padmasana. And all his manifestations are really represented as if meditating. They hold they hold a rudraksha, some have closed eyes. So it is striking that all these representations of Shiva seem to be kind of, to represent him as a yogin. So yoga must have been already well known to the local people by the 9th century. Not only Shiva, but also human figures are represented, possibly Rishi. I mean, they are Shaiva, sages or ascetics. And as you can see, many of them have this yoga patta, so this kind of band, that in India is associated with yogins. In this case, not only, we have also some royal figures, for example, in Borobudur, who are depicted with the yoga patta, but it is still striking, I think, especially because these reliefs are rather early by Indian standards. So you have, not many of these yoga patta represented, I think, already in the 9th century. Now we move to the textual sources, and we can have a look at the largest dictionary of Old Javanese by Zoetmulder, published in '82, and we can look for the word yoga, and we find many instances of this word, not only as yoga but also as compounds, so in compounded form. For example, yoga abhyasa, the practice of yoga, yoga dharaka, the concentration of the mind, translated by Zoetmulder, yoga jnana, the mind or spirit in yoga, literally knowledge of yoga, yoga krama, etc. So this word was very popular. You can see that it really occurs many times in many different texts, as early as the Ramayana, the Old Javanese Ramayana, which is the single, probably, let's say, the earliest Old Javanese text existing, which has survived to our day, except for inscriptions. Indeed, so the Ramayana Kakawin, probably 9th century or early 10th century. In the text, the word yoga occurs with many different meanings: as magical creative power, as a psychophysical meditative technique associated with supernatural powers, as a synonym more or less of asceticism, even as a synonym of release, or in the context of release, moksha, as in the context of samadhi, so this particular anga, or stage of yoga, next to the word japa, so the repetition of mantras, etc. Chitta and dharana, also dharana is one of the yogangas, and chitta is very important, especially Pātañjala yoga is actually the higher mind, the higher, psychic aspect of human beings. So even, the designation of religious persons, mystics, ascetics, called yogins are many. We find many instances of that. And actually the highest level of practitioners is called a yogishvara. So a leader or a lord among yogins, yogi ishvara, which means that yoga must have held a high position in Java, so was very well regarded, and yogis were at a very high status. Now I would like to look at some interesting passages in the sargas, the cantos 24 and 25 of the Old Javanese Ramayana, which mention, some practices, that bizarre practices. Actually, it's an allegorical passage where animals are described as if they were yogins, as if they were different categories of religious people, of ascetics. And in this case, we have, a flying fox, which is a kind of big bat that you can find in Java and the rest of the archipelago. And these flying foxes are described as hanging down from a high tree. Okay, so you have to imagine upside down, basically. That's what they do. And it is possible that these are, again, the animal counterparts of human ascetics carrying out those practices. And again, we have another passage. You have actually couplets of stanzas in Sarga 24 and 25, which describe the same, animals and ascetics. Again, this flying fox wrap themselves in pure or are enwrapped in purity. I wonder whether it's a reference to ashes, to the Pashupata, ashes that were considered pure and white, etc. And in another passage, again, it is explicitly said that the flying fox follow the observance, so a vrata, a technical term indicating a religious, practice of hanging down. And interestingly, we can find this same practice in a much later relief. I think this must be a 14th century temple in East Java. And you clearly see an ascetic with a characteristic turban or hairdo, basically hanging upside down, and practicing this form of vrata. And it seems to have survived, I would say, up to our days, because we find written references to it. This practice is called tapa ngalon. Ngalon is the verb form from the word kalon, and or adjectiva. So in this case, the tapa, the kind of austerity, is practiced as the kalon, and the kalon is the flying fox. Okay, we find these references in 19th and even early 20th century Javanese literature, but even modern folklore. So in certain part of Java, people would immediately understand what tapa ngalon is. Now, if we look at the Indian sources, we find actually a similar practice, perhaps that very same practice, already mentioned at a very early stage of the history of Indian literature. For example, in the Pali canon, so before our era, it is mentioned as the Vagguli Vrata, which indeed it consists in the same practice of suspending oneself upside down from a tree. And Jim Mallinson indeed describes this as possibly a hatha yoga practice insofar that it is not dissimilar from the Viparita Karani Mudra, so this kind of upside down posture. So probably again linked to this technique of preservation of the semen due to gravity, that basically if you hang upside down, you cannot lose your semen, and rather it goes, inward. Now, we find also other observances there linked to yoga in some sense. For instance, the Asidara Vrata, or the knife's edge penance, which is also found in a number of early Shaiva texts, for example, the Brahmayamala. And now I would like to talk about these very two important streams of yoga that existed, across the Indic world and also in Java and Bali. The first is the Shadanga yoga, so the yoga of the 6 ancillaries, which we find in Shaiva, Bauddha, even Vaishnava texts. We also call this Tantric yoga. And on the other hand, the Ashtanga yoga, which is the very popular, Pātañjala yoga, the yoga of Patanjali, and it's sometimes referred to as classical yoga. So the difference between these two large, very important streams of yoga lies in the number of the angas. In Shadanga are 6, and also the types. For instance, as you can see in Ashtanga yoga, we have similar, the same actually angas, except that we do not have tarka, reasoning, that is found in Shadanga yoga. And instead, we have asana, so the kind of physical postures, and yama and niyama, these preliminary practices, commandments, or moral observances, which we also find in Shadanga yoga, but not counted as angas, just as preparatory practices. Now, the classical yoga is based on this literature, the earliest of which is the Yoga Sutra with the commentary, the Bhashya, and then a series of commentaries by Shankara, Vachaspati Mishra, Bhoja, and Vijnana Bhikshu. On the other hand, the Shadanga yoga is found in a very large body of Sanskrit scriptures, and not only in Sanskrit, for example, also Tibetan, mainly of Shaiva, Buddhist, and Vaishnava persuasion. But it is also found in the Puranas, in the Yoga Upanishads, etc. So it's basically a typical form of medieval yoga that you find in medieval literature. Now, this type of yoga also exists in Java, and in fact, we find it in a type of in a genre of literature referred to as tutur or tattva, which basically is often, formed by way of Sanskrit verses and prose passages in Old Javanese, most of the time exegetical. So you have sort of commentary or translation of the Sanskrit, but often many texts are only composed in Old Javanese. By the way, Old Javanese is an Austronesian language which has a very different grammar from Sanskrit, but it contains up to 50% of Sanskrit words. So it has been really influenced by Sanskrit, especially, as far as the lexicon is concerned. So these texts reconfigure, Shaiva, most often material, along localized lines, and they are preserved mostly in palm-leaf manuscripts from the island of Bali. Just some titles of these texts. So if I would give you a definition of yoga in these texts, it would be that they contain some kind of cosmicization of the body, relationship between the micro and the macrocosmos, the visualization of syllables, deities, mantras in the body and outside in the cosmos, etc. So yoga is almost always found in this text. Yoga was very important. And these texts actually, doctrinally speaking, they are most closer to the genre of literature called Siddhantika literature, so Siddhanta Tantras, which have survived in manuscripts mainly from Nepal, southern India, and which in the medieval period, actually, they were the earliest texts of this Shaiva Siddhanta mainstream form of soft Tantra, we could say. From the 6th, 7th century onwards up to the 12th century, it was really probably the commonest form of Shaivism, not only in India, but also outside, for example, in Southeast Asia, mainland and insular Southeast Asia. And it's interesting to see that references to the Shadanga yoga are found in this type of Old Javanese texts. And this is a table where you can see basically a comparison. I have kind of, drawn the occurrences from different texts, also from previous scholars that already researched Shadanga and Ashtanga yoga in Indian text. And as you can see, the fourth column, there are so many titles of texts. These are all mostly the Śaiva texts, and some of them are from Java, like the Vrihaspati Tattva, the Tuturka Mokshan, the Jnana Siddhanta, etc. Now, if we move to the right, we see that there is a text entitled Tattva Jnana. It's the sixth column, and it is interesting insofar that it's an Old Javanese text. And we find some sort of hybrid list. So no 6 angas, but 7, with asana in the beginning, just like in Pātañjala yoga, but also tarka, which is not found in Pātañjala yoga. So it strikes me as a kind of syncretic or middling. We have a list of 7 angas in Indian texts, also, as you can see, and usually they also contain asana. For example, the Goraksha Shataka, Skanda Purana, etc. Now, if you move to the right, we see that the Yoga Sutra in the classical text contains the yama, niyama, asana, and then the other 5 angas, and the Dharma Patanjala. So the Dharma Patanjala is actually an Old Javanese text, and it's interesting because it doesn't contain the Shadanga yoga, which is commonly found in Śaiva texts, both from India and Indonesia, but rather Ashtanga yoga, and I will elaborate on that soon. I just wanted to give you an idea about how it works in practice. Just a quotation, some passages quoted from the Jnana Siddhanta, one of these Sanskrit Old Javanese tutor texts. And you see you have a verse. This is actually a very widespread verse found in many Siddhanta Tantras and also other scriptures from the Indian subcontinent in Sanskrit. And you see that then there is a commentary in Old Javanese, and then every anga, so every one of these ancillaries are described and commented upon. And so it's interesting often to see how the Old Javanese commentary reinterprets these angas in a way that is sometimes a bit different than what you find in the Sanskrit verse. And I think there are similar passages in some Siddhanta Tantra, so it is interesting to see really it just definitely suggests that Shaivism was a very important, the mainstream religion in Java. Now I would like to elaborate on the Dharma Patanjala. That is a very interesting text in many respects. First of all, is found on one of the oldest manuscripts from Indonesia. It is mid-15th century, late 15th century, and this is actually very early for Indonesian manuscript. Most of Balinese manuscripts go back to the 19th century, some to the 18th, 17th, and Javanese manuscripts have basically been destroyed, 99%, and 1% have survived, and they usually go back to this 15th, early 16th century. It's preserved, it's a Codex Unicus, so only one copy exists. And it's a very interesting treatise from the point of view of Śaiva philosophy. It has a very shastric, so a very scholarly style, and it is basically clearly, a text written by a single author or mastermind. As you can see here, so the text, I give you a list of the topics discussed in this text. And as you can see in the lower part of the list, there is also a chapter, we can say, on yoga. It is actually called Yoga Pada in the text, which is interesting because also Indian Siddhanta Tantra have these portions like Jnana Pada of doctrine and Yoga Pada, Charya Pada, etc. And so it really contains basically a description of Ashtanga yoga, which is rather unique in the tutor Śaiva literature from Java and Bali. So what the text does is to reconfigure Pātañjala yoga along theistic lines. So as you may know, classical yoga is not theistic. The Yoga Sutra really don't give much importance to the figure of Ishvara. But this being a thoroughly Shaiva text, so the author wanted to appropriate Ashtanga yoga for some reason and refashion it so as to kind of, become Shaivized. For instance, samadhi, absorption, is important in the soteriology of the text. But the goal is not kaivalya, isolation, but rather Shivasa Atmiya, which means unity or identity with Shiva, which is one of the possible goals of Shaiva schools. Now, this is interesting. So why the author chose Ashtanga instead of Shadanga yoga? Well, this is maybe, I don't know, I have actually think that the status of Patanjali was on the rise in India. After the 8th, 9th century, we start to find many contaminations. So many Shaiva scriptures actually adopt Ashtanga yoga after that period. Also interesting to mention that for this text, the liberation cannot be achieved through initiation, diksha, as in the case of the orthodox Shaiva Siddhanta, but rather through yoga. This is very clear. There is a Purva Paksha and an Uttara Paksha, and the Purva Paksha actually is advocating for Diksha, and then the Siddhanta is that indeed Diksha is not helpful, but rather yoga. And this is actually, you can find that in almost all the tutor texts. So we are dealing here with a kind of different form of Shaiva Siddhanta, which is heavily influenced by yoga, soteriology. And actually, this appropriation is already found in India, as I was telling you, for example, in the Puranas and in many tantras, especially the rather late ones, we really find a kind of increasing influence of Pātañjala yoga. So what the Dharma Patanjala does is basically to take only 4 shlokas, 4 verses in Sanskrit, which are clearly based on Patanjali Yoga Sutra and the Bhashya as well, and then add long prose passages which also reflect the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, but also other commentaries possibly. This strikes me as similar to the Kitab Patanjala, which is also was supposed to be from a versified Sanskrit version, and also mixes different commentaries. So these are the verses, as you can see. They have a kind of corresponding portion in the Yoga Sutra in terms of sutra, of course, but these are versified sutras. Of course, they are quite corrupt, and the result of my restoration is on the left column. And these are all the topics treated in the Yoga Pada. So as you can see, really the text, the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, or the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, if you prefer, is followed from the beginning to the end, especially the 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters. And then interestingly, the final chapter, the 4th chapter, is not found in the text. And this probably means that it was not very interesting for the author, or more speculatively and daringly, that perhaps the 4th pada, as it has been suggested by some scholars, was kind of spurious, was added at a later date. And this is based on an early version of the sutra, which didn't have the 4th pada, but there is no way to demonstrate it. So again, the text really stresses the importance of samadhi, just like the Patanjala Yoga Shastra. And again, actually links it to the Lord Shiva, okay, so to this Paramartha, supreme reality or summum bonum in a Shaiva sense. So Kaivalya is reinterpreted, as a state of union, basically. So as a manifestation of the powers of Shiva, which means identity with this supreme deity. So there are interesting passages. I think I don't want to now go into them, that they are quite striking because they also reflect, sometimes polemics or, passages that are found in Shaiva literature from India. For instance, again, this kind of, some Shaiva authors mention Patanjali as a lower form of revelation, and they kind of give the they describe the higher status of Shadanga yoga and Shaiva yoga. But here there is really an attempt to merge the two systems somehow. Yes, another passage where samadhi is redefined according to atheistic agenda, right? And so basically the salvific knowledge, samya jnana, is equated to samadhi, and you know, is essential for attaining the supreme pleasure, sukha vishesha, which is again final liberation. And again, prajna, which is also a word found in yoga, classical yoga literature, is actually said to be of one level, samapada, with the summum bonum. So it means basically the same as Shiva. All right. So the consciousness, the liberated consciousness or mind, chitta, is becomes kaivalya, but kaivalya means actually to be the same as Shiva, not isolated. Now I would move to Bali actually, 4 or 5 centuries later, and talk about a small treatise, a booklet actually, called Ajisankhya, published in 1947 by a Balinese intellectual, one of the first books of, let's say, describing Balinese Hinduism. And this booklet is interesting because, again, like the Dharma Patanjala, it actually, you know, it is thoroughly Shaiva, you know, thoroughly theistic, but it also adopts Ashtanga yoga instead of Shadanga yoga. And this is quite striking, especially because, you know, on the left column, you can see all the sources used by the author. The author acknowledges his sources, and they are all Shaiva texts in Old Javanese or Sanskrit and Old Javanese that he has used to kind of, you know, explain Shaiva doctrine to the masses. This is actually written in common Balinese. But there is one exception, that is the Yoga Sutra in the old Dutch spelling, you know, which turns out to be the Kitab Yoga Sutra Pātañjala, which is a book, you know, actually a translation into English of Manilana Budviveni, which is just a kind of misspelling for Manilana Budhai Dvivedi, published in 1890, then translated into Dutch, and then into Javanese, okay, in an asrama, so in a kind of, you know, religious community in Surakarta, Central Java, all right. Then again translated into Malay and printed. And so this booklet reached the author and he liked it. He just felt, you know, it was an authority. Why? I suspect because, as you can see on the left side, this is the front matter and the cover of this book in Javanese script. And there is the Theosophical Society stamp there. And so the Theosophical Society was actually very influential in those years. Many intellectual, but also, you know, politicians were Theosophists. And somehow I think it contributed to kind of, you know, educate, let's say, give an access to the Javanese and the Balinese to Indian philosophy, yoga. And so this Patanjali, of course, was, you know, already classical, right? And so I think the author felt like he needed to upgrade the Shadanga yoga. He wanted to use the Eightfold Yoga. And this also continues later. There are other books, for example, this by Rishi Ananda Kusuma, which do exactly the same thing. They are based on thorough, you know, Shaiva, Old Javanese sources, but at the same time, they also use Ashtanga yoga. And in this case, there is a book, Kundalini Yoga, by Swami Shivananda, another of those Indian, you know, kind of, we can say, reformers or intellectuals of the 19th century. So I think you can try to compare these things. I think they all suggest that Patanjali's status was on the rise, and so strikingly enough, you know, Indonesian authors, both in the 15th century or before, and the 20th century, they decided to adopt, you know, Patanjali as an authority in terms of yoga. Now, I would like to tell you about yoga in Bali. As I said, Bali is still predominantly Hindu, and you know, yoga is a common term. People have different understandings of it, of course. I would say that if you talk to practitioners, you know, educated people, their understanding of yoga, as I said before, would be mostly in terms of, you know, visualizations of syllables, okay? And in this case, they are called the Dashakshara, so the 10 sacred syllables, including the 5 Panchabrahma mantras, so these 5 names, the first syllables of the name of Shiva, Sa, Ba, Ta, A, I, Ishvara, or Sadyojata, Vamadeva, etc. And there is a lot of speculation about the Om also, both as a akshara, so as a script, and also as a sound. So various mantras, and it's basically an emanatory system. And this system is really practiced. This is very much part of the Balinese way to carry out psychophysical practices, to get power, and to get liberation even. In fact, there is a body of text where this placement of syllables, in the body is described, and there are all sorts of correspondences with micro and macrocosmical realities. This is a very tantric, form of yoga, I would say. And a very, very common practice is that of the Ruabineda, the 2 split in Old Javanese. Why? Because so this practice involves visualization of the body of the yogin, and fire coming from below, and the water, so rain, coming from the top of the head, and meeting in between in the heart and producing smoke. Okay, the smoke would be, it's a metaphor for the Atman, for the life principle, the spirit. And this practice can lead to different results. It can lead to rejuvenation, liberation even, or death. And on the right, you see these are illustrations by Gusti Mirdiana, a Balinese painter. And so on the right, you see also a very popular type of understanding of yoga in Bali, that is the visualization of the syllable Om and its various components upside down. So coming from the heart and then upside down in the head and meeting in the center. So I think these are possibly reconfigurations of practices and ideas already found in Indian sources. For instance, the visualization of the Amrita, the nectar, as a water vessel located inside the skull, in the brain, and then flowing down and again transformed into the reversed Om located in the cranial vault, in the upper part, etc., in various subtle center, reflect possibly, Hatha Yoga practices, maybe Kechari Mudra. So it's about really the production in this cavity behind the tongue, right, between the nose and the tongue, let's say, of this Amrita, this nectar of immortality. There's nothing about the role of the tongue, actually. No, actually, there is, sorry. At least in the Dharma Patanjala, there is a very obscure reference to that, but it is mostly about visualization, usually. Whereas in India, it's more about turning the tongue backwards to release this nectar. And these practices are also connected to Bhuta Shuddhi, so to the purification of the elements. For example, the yogin has to imagine the body burnt and turning into ashes, and then, being washed away. So this is another tantric practice of the purification of the elements. And if you go to Bali, you will see a kind of, huge popular literature. For example, in this case, the Kanda Empat, these 5 mystical siblings that every person is believed to have, at least if you have done a certain ritual, at birth. This is an Austronesian, practice. You find it in other parts of Indonesian archipelago, but it has been kind of hybrid, it has become a hybrid in Bali. There are some Śaiva elements in it, and it's very, very popular. One of the most, characteristic, really, understanding of yoga in Bali is that it involves these 4 siblings, and they're in our body, and you can actually, so to speak, exploit them to do certain operations, to acquire certain powers, to purify, and even achieve liberation. Then, if we talk about yoga, we cannot, not mention the Shaiva priest, so to speak, or practitioner called Pedanda Shiva. They are Brahmins, basically, they perform every day the Surya Sevana, this ritual, Shaiva ritual, where the performer actually becomes Shiva, like in the South Indian version of a similar ritual, and produces holy water. Balinese religion really revolves around holy water for purification, and only Shiva, of course, can produce it. So the priest can do this on a daily basis. And it has been argued that these priests are actually yogins, tantric yogins. There is a lot of vocabulary borrowed from yoga text. For instance, even the practices of pranayama, dhyana, etc., incorporated in the ritual, which is also found in India, of course. But this is a totally private ritual, so it doesn't involve. So this priest actually mutters the mantra, perform with his eyes closed, even if there is people around. They are not important. It's not for display. It's just for himself in order to become Shiva. He assumes also yogic posture, so it really looks like he's meditating, actually. He's visualizing, performing visualization. And something that always struck me is really the fact that, unlike in India, the worship in the temples is not iconic. So there are no images of the gods except on certain ritual occasions. And so the common people who go to temple, they do worship, sambahyang, worship the gods. There is no bhakti or devotion. There is actually yoga. They are actually performing yoga. First the stage of asana, then pranayama, then dhyana, visualization, etc. So it's something that strikingly, another striking form of ritual yoga, we can say, rather than outer devotion or worship of the image of a deity. Then another very important type of yoga that was common in both ancient Java before the 15th century and Bali later is the so-called Utkranti or Sadyutkranti, which is a Sanskrit expression meaning the expulsion or the violent expulsion of the breath or the life principle from the body, actually from the fontanelle, the cranial, the tip of the skull. Okay, and this is a practice already known from Shaiva texts, even some Buddhist texts actually in India. And so this practice is basically important at the time of death. It is a very esoteric practice. Often descriptions are quite obscure, I have to say. But really the stress is that the practitioner has to practice it during the life to accompany death. So when the time comes, and it is very important also to know the kind of sign that the death is coming, you can actually pronounce the right mantras and let the soul go out, the life principle go out from the skull and reach Shiva. So the point is not to be distracted by anything, but be just straight like the course of an arrow to reach a higher level in any event, a higher level of reincarnation or even liberation. So it is often mentioned with this kunchi rahasya, this secret key that you use to open, or close actually the apertures, the holes, the bodily orifices, and expel the breath to break the cranium. Also associated also with pranayama. And it is not only found in this very technical, religious text, but also in kakawin, which are, poems read also by other members of society, not only Brahmins or initiates. So it's a common literary trope, even in, belles lettres. So it must have been widespread in ancient Java. Yes, so we often have this unification of the syllables and ah, which represent opposites, so water and fire, Uma and Shiva, Pradhana and Purusha, the two syllables that are also imagined in the body to obtain Amrita. And so at the time of death, they should be kept separated, Bhineda, and reversed, as the diagram I showed, the drawing I showed before. so that the fire actually moves downwards and water upwards. So in that sense, you can achieve, you can die basically instead of, you know, rejuvenating and etc. And you can reach from the Shivadvara, the door of Shiva, a higher station. So it's all about being aware and using the right mantras at the time of death. And I think that this practice was so widespread and well known among society that it has even survived in, you know, modern Balinese ritual. So anthropologist Michelle Stephen has written about this, about the Balinese Pitrayajna, so the funerary ritual, as some form of ritualized yogic art of dying, so ritualized utkranti. So it's kind of reenactment of the absorption of the cosmic principles, you know, that make the Śaiva cosmos. And in fact, the priest actually whispers certain mantras in the eye of the deceased, which is about to be burnt. And there are all the characteristic mantra that we find in the Utkranti, they are found. And so it seems that Bali has elaborated a post-mortem ritualistic version of this yogic practice for the benefit of the lay people, because again, this was a very esoteric practice, which is nowadays, you know, I don't think anybody would be able to do it, or maybe very few, you know, initiate. But it's kind of way to also, you know, push a little bit the soul of the deceased, of the common people, in order to help him find a way back to the origin, you know, back to Shiva or to a higher level of incarnation. Yet another form of yoga which is found in Bali is what we can call sexual yoga. So we have quite, you know, well, a few manuals in Old Javanese and Sanskrit sometimes, tutur, which basically, you know, describe a form of visualization, meditation, which has to be done during the sexual act with the partner, you know. For example, like the Anguli Praveshane in the Rani Shastra. So sex is a religious practice where sexual climax and pleasure and liberation, or, you know, meditation are central. Okay, so you always have in the belles lettres even echoes of these practices. For example, the hero, prince, you know, gets married, so there is the kind of royal wedding, in the end becomes a king and marries his partner, and it is called yoga of the bedchamber basically. So they you know, the first night of the marriage, they have a sexual encounter and they become transfigured, so to speak, into the primordial couple of Shiva and Uma, or Kama and Rati, so the god of love and his partner, or Shiva Ardhanarishvara, so they come united in one single deity, transfigured human being, which is half male and half female. And this idea really seems to have persisted, to have survived among practitioners of modern Javanese mysticism, which is basically there are many schools, you know, many traditions of Javanese mysticism. Most of them are Islamic or Islamicized, but they clearly, you know, preserve many elements of pre-Islamic Hindu lore. And they really focus on, you know, they stress this, the path, you know, to perfection is not as a celibate ascetic, but rather as a married householder, and so to practice certain forms also of, you know, sexual yoga. And even there are some transgressive practices found even nowadays, you know, in on some mountainous areas of Java. But I don't know if this really have to do with yoga, but still they suggest that this understanding of, you know, the mixture between sex and meditation was very much part of the you know, civilization of Java, especially, and Bali. And well, I mean, as I speak, you know, nowadays in Bali, of course, there is a very flourishing, you know, we can say, industry of yoga. But you see, these are translation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So there is a kind of continuous, you know, influx, I would say, of again, Indian ideas. The Balinese, of course, are looking at India as the source of Hinduism. Sometimes they forget that their own Hinduism is actually, in some cases, I say provocatively, more, origin, I would say, than Indian Hinduism, because it has preserved very archaic traits, very archaic doctrines, that beliefs, etc., that are not found anymore in India because they have changed. And if you go to Ubud, I think some of you know that it has become one of the centers, of transnational contemporary yoga. But this yoga is indeed, as you can see, probably as you have realized, quite different from the understandings of yoga by the Balinese. Although this kind of modern postural yoga is becoming more and more important, many Balinese now, if you are an early riser, around 6 a.m. in the public, places, in the squares, parks, they actually do yoga. But this is kind of, modern westernized yoga, reintroduced from India rather recently. Well, this was all I wanted to share with you. And yeah, since this is probably esoteric for most of you, I'm happy to, take questions, clarify anything that was not clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. It's very rich and stimulating. I have so many questions, but gosh, where to start? I've written down so many. The first one, I was just wondering, with the Dharma Patanjala, why the text has that name when from the synopsis that you gave, the yoga section seemed, just one part of a much bigger text. I wasn't sure about the proportion, what proportion of the text it occupies. So it surprised me that the text itself should be called Pātañjala. I mean, is the main purpose of it to present this form of yoga, and the rest of it is sort of ancillary?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the answer might be a bit surprising, but probably the Yoga Pada forms a third of the text, so it is, I would say, not the most important part. The rest is, the remaining part is thoroughly Śaiva. But I think here there is a conflation. I think the author of the text knew. I mean, he had the Patanjala Yoga Shastra before his eyes, or some other text, so he had the kind of understanding that Patanjali, was the author of this text, was important for this type of tradition. But on the other hand, I think the Patanjala is referring to is also another Patanjala, which is very important in the Śaiva tradition of Java and Bali. And it's probably, I think Alexis Sanderson was the first to suggest that Patanjala might be actually a kind of misspelling or corruption or localization of Pātañjala, which would be a name of Agastya. In India, you have Pitabdi, for example, the one who drank the ocean. And I tend to agree with this interpretation because this Patanjala is actually the fifth character, the fifth, the member of a pentad, which is made by the 4 gurus of the Pashupata tradition. So the name of the 4, Maitri, Karuna, etc., which are found in very early Indian scripture, all connected with different streams of Pashupatism. So this very early Atimarga type of Shaivism. And the 5th is usually Lakulisha, okay? But in Java, there is no Lakulisha whatsoever. It's never mentioned in any text. But instead, we have Pātañjala. And it is interesting that Lakulisha, it has been suggested that Lakulisha was probably added at a later stage in India itself by some Pashupatas. So up to the 5th century, Lakulisha was actually not very prominent in iconography, for example. So it seems that in Java, rather, the main figure is Agastya. And interestingly, it is they are brothers, not like in India. They are conceived of as brothers. And Pātañjala is the youngest, but also the one into which the god Shiva incarnates. Just like the episode of Kaya Varohana, in Indian sources. So there is this incarnation, basically a Brahmin dies, an incarnation of Shiva dies, then a funeral is performed, the corpse is burned, etc., and then it kind of resuscitates in the form of Pātañjala. And so I really think that the author here kind of, he wanted to, and this is all described in the text, in the Dharma Patanjala. It's the only text that actually describes this episode of the incarnation of Patanjala. So I think we have a conflation there. The author definitely knew the Indian Patanjali, and he played a little bit. He wanted to give the Dharma, the book or the doctrine of Pātañjala, but actually this Pātañjala was more familiar to him. That is the Śaiva Javanese version, you know, of this incarnation of Shiva known as Lakulisha. So it's a bit complicated, but I hope that gives the idea.
Yeah, and they're complicated but convincing. That seems to make sense of it, because otherwise, why would it be such? Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask chair's privilege for another question at least, maybe more. As I say, I've got loads. I was wondering, so you at the beginning, you identified, we saw a picture from the temple in Borobudur, was it, of Maitreya standing on one leg, and was identified in the textual, what was it in? It was Gandhavyuha as perhaps a yoga posture, was identified as a yoga posture, and also the Tapa Ngalong, if I'm pronouncing that correctly,
exactly.
This hanging upside down position. Now, I have, in recent years, I've sort of somewhat changed my position on the origins of Hatha Yoga, and I think all the distinctive Hatha Yoga practices are probably new innovations around the 11th century, something like that, and that these older techniques, and these certainly would be identified, and it even says there, if it's your translation, I'm not sure, but it identifies this practice as arduous practices, which suggest tapas, and are, you know, pre-11th century physical practices tend to be some form of tapas. So I'm wondering, if my question is there any evidence in Java or Bali of any of the more distinctively Hatha Yoga practices, you know, balancing postures that can't be held for a long time, these mudra. I mean, you also showed the Khetri mudra. Yeah, there did seem to be some crossover there, and you did suggest that, I think, was it in the Dharma Patanjala, there's some mention of the tongue being used to access Amrita, but I mean, that would perhaps be an early Hatha technique. And sorry, this is a very long question, but I think hopefully the gist of it is simple. But connected with it, you kindly, a few years ago, when I was working on an article about the transmission of Hatha Yoga from Buddhism to Shaivism in South India, and you pointed out this image of Matsyendra from, I think it was in Java, on a statue of Chamundi. That was right. So I'm wondering, that might sort of encapsulate my question, is there any evidence of the slightly later post-Matsyendra Hatha traditions of Goraksha, the 84 Siddhas, and any of these balancing postures, these more complex yogic asanas and these yogic mudras?
Yeah, well, the answer is simple. Unfortunately not. I didn't find really much evidence.
Yeah, that's
so I think we are at that period, you know, late stage. I didn't find. So
what does that say? Sorry to interrupt, but what does that say about the time frame of the transmission of
exactly? I mean, again, I think that these elements must be much earlier, and we find many archaic elements. So I tend to think that the transmission was early, and those elements that were stuck, you know, they persisted, you know, throughout the medieval period, and even to the present, some of them. But I didn't see much in terms of real Hatha Yoga, like post, you know, 12th century, whatever things. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that maybe those similarities were found even in other Indian texts, in other traditions before, or maybe something, you know, it just arrived in Java, and it was reconfigured, changed, you know, and now in Bali we find these practices, you know, which seem to be kind of related, you know, but not exactly as the Hatha Yoga. And also the postures, you know, I really don't find much evidence in terms of postural yoga. This is really something that, yeah, it's interesting, I would say. So seems to have been to have developed in a different, way than in India.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's also rather supports my theory that these practices were an innovation in India at the beginning of the second millennium as well.
Indeed.
So thanks for that. There was, and so we've got a couple of questions in the slide, but I've got one more observation. You mentioned the bedchamber yoga, and that seemed to have strong parallels with the Tirumantiram, it's Tamil text. I wonder if you've looked at that. That's just a suggestion.
Okay.
It might be worth having a look in there. And finally, my last question, this is a question, is the Tapa Ngalong still practiced, or has it died out?
Yes. I have a student of mine from Java confirmed that, some Javanese mystics, this Kejawen stream, actually practice it. I've never seen myself, and I don't know how many people are able to do this or are aware, but it is found in text in modern Javanese. It is mentioned and described, so it seems to be still alive in some parts of Java.
Oh, great, thank you. I will be following up. I will asking you more about that, and that again suggests, as you indicated, that there are certain more archaic elements of Hindu practice that persist in Java that have died out in India as well. So that's interesting. Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the Slido. One from Ruth Westerby. If we go to Ruth, please.
Hi, thanks ever so much for your presentation. You mentioned in the Dharma Patanjala the inclusion of embryology and generation, and I wondered why you thought that was included in the text and if it had any particular relationship with yoga. Thanks.
I see. I don't think so. I don't see a relationship with yoga in that part. It is very Shaiva, and many Shaiva texts have, because they describe the lower tattvas, and the human being, the conception, etc. So that is thoroughly Shaiva. It doesn't need to have a relationship with yoga. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a question from Vic. So if we could go to Vic, please.
Hello, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. It was just really eye-opening. What I can see from your presentation when you showed some sculptural images, it kind of suggests an ascetic path of yoga. And then when you were discussing text, there seems to be kind of this sexual yoga, which is kind of like a parallel householder path, which doesn't necessarily kind of connotate with asceticism as such. So I was just wondering, does it kind of lean towards a suggestion that yoga reached a kind of a broader spectrum of people rather than just an ascetic path? That it kind of could be for yoga for ascetics and yoga for like the grahasta, the priest, for example.
Yes. Yeah, indeed, it's a fascinating question. I am not sure if I can answer that and give you like, the percentage of, but it makes sense to me. Yes, the texts actually are full of tropes of yogins as ascetics for sure, but there is more to this. I think these texts were, after all, these texts like the Dharma Patanjala, etc., were read and copied and written by Brahmins, householders also. Especially in Bali, actually, these priests are householders. They have wives, children. The wife sometimes can become a priest, herself, and so there is definitely that aspect, both in the ancient period, I think, and in the modern period. So I can only say both are clearly there, but there are this sexual yoga, that are clearly really more. They target the householders, so it's really clear there. This does not involve asceticism, but rather something that it's allowed, for householders, and so both paths are found in the sources. Yeah.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Erica. the Slido. So we can go to Erica, please.
Hi there, thank you. I'm curious if in the yoga of dying, there are any postural or gestural bodily shape indications given, or if that's inferred and assumed while breath sort of takes precedence.
Yes, I think most of it is assumed. I mean, I think that the basic idea is that you are in Padmasana, you know, so you assume the posture required by pranayama, then you do pranayama, you know, and then you take that practice to the next level, you know, and manipulate those mantras and syllables, and then you can achieve this kind of yogic dying. But it's really, these descriptions are very esoteric. It's really, they just stress the fact that the mind should be very focused. You cannot think, if you think about, you know, I don't know, what you have eaten, or I mean, you're going to incarnate as maybe a chicken if you have eaten chicken, or you see, these kind of things. So you really have to keep your mind absolutely empty and focus. There are metaphors, for example, the metaphor of the archer, you know, and the arrow, which has to be aimed correctly and then straight, you know, released, just like the soul, the breath is released from the body. So this kind of, you know, descriptions, not very much in terms of postures.
Okay, thanks. So we've got no more on the slide. Oh, hang on, there's an anonymous one. So I shall read that one out. The death practice, so this, what was it called, Sadyottkranti, reminds me of the Poa practice in Vajrayana. Do you know if there's been any comparative research?
Yes, that's very interesting. I think that I'm not that sure, but somebody must have looked at, you know, Utkranti in Buddhist Vajrayana context. I think probably even there's a recent article, but not enough has been done. So it's really would be very interesting. I mean, I say obviously, I don't know, but for me, it's very possible that this practice was borrowed by the Buddhists from the Shaivas, and you know, it kind of developed even in Tibet, you know, in Vajrayana Buddhist contexts. And I think there are similar practices even in Japan. So in other, you know, religions, let's say, Buddhist traditions of Asia, they're probably not the same, but still there is this idea of, you know, the good death and certain practices, you know, to be done. So I think it will be most interesting to do a project on this Utkranti, yogic death practices across the Indic world. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we've got no more. We have got a few more minutes. I think we've got you for another 5 minutes. I hope that's okay. Because I've got one more question. It sort of leads on from that. You were talking about the parallels between the different traditions, and I was intrigued by what you were saying about the systems of where fire. So we have fire at the base of the central channel, yeah, and then you said water or rain at the top. And then they meet in the heart to produce, I think once you said smoke, and then once you said amrita. Now, of course, this is similar to the very prevalent yogic doctrine of fire at the base and amrita at the top. And then normally everything has to be raised to the top rather to the heart, although actually perhaps that's echoing some older Śaiva material. But it's also substantially different, I think, from the normal yogic model, and that just made me think, maybe wonder whether you think that there's a sort of a Southeast Asian substrate, whether there's much input into these practices, you know, in the same way that people will often say with Tibetan Buddhist practice that it's overlaid onto some older tradition, sometimes identified as Burn and so forth. Can you detect any sort of indigenous practices within the text you're looking at?
Yes, the $1 million question. I mean, it's very difficult to establish this. I mean, in order to establish this, one would have to look at, you know, let's say Austronesian beliefs, you know, practices in other areas of the archipelago, but we really don't have these kind of things. The problem, I mean, also the fascinating aspect of studying these traditions is that much of this this material, you know, is like a house built with the same bricks that you find in India, but you know, they use the same bricks, but the result is different. The form, the shape of the house is different, but you can still recognize the elements, like a puzzle that kind of, you know. So I would say I often tend to, whenever evidence is lacking, which is probably 90% of the time, I interpret this as, again, parallel developments, you know, that look different, but you can still see, you know, the essence that maybe, as you said, it came from early texts, Śaiva texts. Yeah, there is this Agni Mandala, right, Vayu Mandala, I mean, these kind of ideas in the yogic, the subtle body. Or maybe not, especially the importance of the fire and the water. I mean, these are very, let's say, you know, part of the daily life in Java and Bali. Volcanoes, you know, coming, of course, from below, and rain from above, and then meeting in between, you see on the earth. So why not? In the case of the Kandam path, there I can really see, I mean, I really have a strong evidence that this Kandam path, so these 5 siblings, are found, you know, from, let's say, Sumatra to Timor, you know, all Austronesian societies. But then they have been also described in terms of this Pancharishi, which are the siblings, the children of Shiva, you know, and the 5th, like the 5th of the Kandam path, is the most important, and is the expression of the ego of the I, which is actually Shiva himself. So you see, you can clearly see that there is a kind of merging of 2 similar sets of pentas and set of ideas. But in this case, it would be more difficult to really say that there is an indigenous substrate.
Yeah, gosh, thank you. And that, but what you say brings very true. And thinking about this idea that you mentioned of there being smoke as well, smoke being created, which I don't think you get in any yogic text, not that I'm aware of. But if there's volcano, fire and rain, that seems...
Exactly. The only explanation I can find is, I mean, one of the possible explanations is precisely this kind of natural, you know, the metaphor for a natural process.
Yeah. Great. Well, we've got no more questions in the Slido, and we're up to our time limit. So thank we just, I mean, I'm going to say thank you very much, but then hand over back to Theo. But thanks, it's absolutely fascinating. Such rich material, and yeah, really so productive to look at this different. Well, for me, obviously, it's a different window onto the Indian traditions, but obviously, it's a rich and important tradition in itself, and